In 1585, Sir Richard Grenville sailed to Roanoke Island with about 108 men, sent by Sir Walter Raleigh to establish a base for exploration and trade off the coast of what is now North Carolina. The settlers built a small fort and began surveying the surrounding lands. But from the very start, relations with the nearby Algonquian-speaking people were uneasy. The English depended on them for fresh food and local knowledge, but misunderstandings and disputes were frequent. The tension came to a head when the English accused the people of Aquascogoc of stealing a silver cup. In response, the settlers burned the tribe's village and destroyed their crops. This act ended any hope of friendly relations, and by the summer of 1586, hunger and uncertainty set in. When Sir Francis Drake stopped at Roanoke on his way back from the Caribbean, most of the settlers chose to leave with him. A year later, in 1887, the English settlers returned to Roanoke Island. This time, they aimed to establish a permanent settlement, and the group included men, women, and children, led by Governor John White. But upon arrival, they had few provisions, missed the start of the planting season, and faced hostility from nearby indigenous groups, a lingering result of the violence during the 1585 expedition. White then returned to England later that year to secure supplies, but his return was delayed by the outbreak of war with Spain, which required all available ships for defense against the Armada. When White finally sailed back in 1590, he found the settlement abandoned. The houses and fortifications had been dismantled, and the word Croton was carved into a post. There were no signs of struggle, and the settlers were never located. The loss of the Roanoke colony underscored the risks of overseas settlement. Spain controlled most of the Americas and had destroyed rival European outposts in the past. English planners concluded that any future colony would need to be positioned where it could receive supplies from the sea, but remain far enough inland to avoid sudden attack by the Spanish fleet. So in the spring of 1607, English settlers with 3 ships tried again to establish a settlement in the Americas, and this time they sailed into the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. Aboard were just over 100 settlers, sent by the Virginia Company of London, a joint stock venture hoping to profit from the riches of the New World. Their instructions were to find a secure location inland, defend it from the Spanish, and turn it into a profitable colony. They chose a swampy peninsula on the James River, which they named Jamestown, after King James I. This marked the birth of the colony of Virginia, a name first given in the 1580s by Sir Walter Raleigh in honor of Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. The site had good defensive advantages, deep water for ships, and it was far enough upriver to avoid easy attack by the Spanish Navy. But it was also mosquito-infested, brackish, and surrounded by the powerful Powhatan Confederacy, who controlled most of the region. The early years were brutal. Starvation, disease, and occasional conflict with the Powhatan nearly wiped out the colony. At one point in 1609 to 1610, during what is known as the Starving Time, the population dropped from about 500 after more settlers arrived to just 60. But tobacco changed everything. In 1612, John Rolfe successfully cultivated a sweeter strain of the plant, and suddenly Virginia had a cash crop worth exporting to Europe. Plantations began to spread along the James River, pushing into Powhatan land and shaping the colony's early boundaries. The next great settlement came not from businessmen chasing profits, but from a group of religious dissenters fleeing persecution, the Pilgrims. These were English Protestants who had broken away from the Church of England entirely, believing it was beyond reform. After years of living in exile in the Netherlands, where they worried their children were losing their English identity, they secured financial backing from London merchants to start a new life in America. In September 1620, about 100 of them boarded the Mayflower and set sail across the Atlantic, aiming to settle near the northern edge of the Virginia Company's territory. But storms blew them far off course, and after 2 grueling months at sea, they landed far to the north on the rocky coast of what they named Plymouth. This was outside the jurisdiction of any English colony, meaning they technically had no legal authority to govern themselves. To avoid chaos, the men drafted and signed the Mayflower Compact, a brief but groundbreaking agreement pledging to form a civil body politic and make decisions for the good of the colony. Their first winter was devastating. Unprepared for the brutal New England cold, nearly half the settlers died from starvation, exposure, and disease. Survival came only with the help of the Wampanoag people, particularly a man named Esquanto, who taught them how to plant corn, find shellfish, and fertilize crops with fish. The alliance with the Wampanoag led to a harvest celebration in 1621. Later mythologized as the first Thanksgiving, Plymouth remained small but stable, never growing as quickly as later colonies. By the late 1620s, it was joined by a much larger wave of Puritan settlers who did not wish to separate from the Church of England, but sought to purify it. Led by John Winthrop, this group established the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630 under a royal charter. Winthrop envisioned their colony as a city upon a hill, a model Christian society governed by strict moral codes and church discipline. Further north, English fishermen and traders had already begun establishing outposts along the rocky coast of what was then called the province of Maine. The region had been granted to Sir Ferdinando Gorges, who dreamed of creating a semi-feudal province under his personal control. But his plans faltered due to low immigration, scattered settlements, and poor governance. With little effective leadership in place, Massachusetts Bay Colony saw an opportunity. In 1652, Massachusetts Bay Colony moved to claim jurisdiction over the scattered settlements, citing its own charter, and most settlers accepted Massachusetts's authority in exchange for legal protection and organized courts. This brought the northern settlements under the administration of Massachusetts, tying them politically and economically to the growing Puritan colony. For decades, Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay coexisted as separate colonies, though their Puritan identities bound them closely together. Finally, in 1691, Plymouth was merged into Massachusetts Bay under a new royal charter, which also confirmed Massachusetts' control over the northern settlements, creating one of the largest and most influential colonies in New England. In 1623, settlers from the Massachusetts Bay Area moved north to establish the first English communities in what would become New Hampshire. Some sought greater independence from Massachusetts' strict religious and political control, while others were attracted by the promise of trade and fishing along the coast. The land they settled had been granted years earlier by the Council for New England to Captain John Mason, who envisioned it as a separate province focused on fishing, trade, and timber. When disputes arose between Massachusetts and Mason's heirs over who had authority in the region, the English crown intervened. Because New Hampshire's timber, especially tall pines used for ship masts, was strategically important for the Royal Navy, England placed the settlements under direct royal control. In 1638, New Hampshire was formally recognized as a separate colony with its own council and governor, independent of Massachusetts. Religious tensions in Massachusetts also drove other breakaways. In 1636, Puritan minister Roger Williams was banished for challenging the colony's rigid religious policies and insisting that native lands be fairly purchased. He acquired land from the Narragansett and founded Providence plantations, where freedom of worship was guaranteed. A few years later, Anne Hutchinson, another dissenter, established Portsmouth in 1638. Over the next few years, other small towns were founded nearby, and together these settlements were united into the colony of Rhode Island, a community defined by religious tolerance, elected self-government, and independence from Massachusetts control. At the same time, Thomas Hooker led a group of settlers southwest into the fertile Connecticut River Valley. Like others leaving Massachusetts, they were frustrated by its restrictive politics and strict religious rules. They founded Hartford, Wethersfield, and Windsor, acquiring land from the Pequot, a powerful native confederacy that dominated trade in the region. But conflict broke out when competition over the fur trade, English expansion into Pequot territory, and a series of violent incidents, including the killing of an English trader, led the settlers to retaliate. This sparked the Pequot War, during which English settlers, allied with the Narragansett and Mohegan tribes, attacked and destroyed major Pequot villages. The defeat of the Pequot broke their control over the region and opened the Connecticut River Valley to further English settlement. In 1639, Hooker and his followers drafted the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, one of the first written constitutions in the Western world, establishing an elected governor and legislature. Meanwhile, another Puritan group founded the colony of New Haven in 1638, aiming to build an even stricter, Bible-based society. New Haven remained independent for over 2 decades, but was eventually merged with Hartford and the surrounding river settlements under a single royal charter in 1662, creating the unified colony of Connecticut. While New England's Puritans were establishing towns along the northern Atlantic, other European powers were vying for control of the mid-Atlantic coast. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company founded New Amsterdam on the southern tip of Manhattan, creating the colony of New Netherland as a center of trade in the fur industry. Its population quickly became one of the most diverse in North America, including Dutch, Germans, Scandinavians, Africans, and later English settlers. The Hudson River gave the colony access to inland trade and strong relations with native tribes, and the Dutch built fortifications and walls to defend their commercial hub from both native attacks and European rivals. In 1638, Swedish settlers founded New Sweden along the lower Delaware River, building Fort Christina and trading with the Lenape and Susquehannock. But Swedish control was short-lived. In 1655, the Dutch seized New Sweden and folded it into New Netherland, strengthening their dominance of the region. That dominance ended in 1664, when England sent a fleet to seize New Netherland as part of its plan to unify its colonies along the Atlantic coast. The Dutch surrendered without a fight, and the territory was divided into New English provinces. New Amsterdam was renamed New York in honor of the Duke of York, while the Delaware settlements were placed under English control. Meanwhile, the lands west of the Hudson River were carved out of New York and granted to 2 proprietors, Lord Berkeley and Sir George Carteret, forming New Jersey. The colony was split into East Jersey and West Jersey, each with its own administration and land policies. New Jersey attracted a diverse mix of settlers, Dutch, Swedes, Finns, English Puritans, and Quakers, thanks to promises of generous land grants and religious freedom. Its fertile soil and temperate climate supported grain and livestock farming, while its many rivers and ports encouraged trade with neighboring colonies. Disputes over borders, land titles, and governance plagued the colony for decades. But in 1702, East and West Jersey were united under a royal governor, formally creating the province of New Jersey, with boundaries clarified through surveys and treaties with Native Americans. Further west, a new experiment in colonization was taking shape. In 1681, King Charles II granted a vast tract of land to William Penn, a Quaker, as repayment for a debt owed to Penn's father. This became Pennsylvania. Although Penn now had legal ownership under English law, he went a step further. He negotiated and purchased land from the Lenape and other native nations to ensure peaceful settlement. Penn envisioned his colony as a holy experiment, a place of religious freedom, fair governance, and just treatment of native peoples. Penn laid out Philadelphia as a carefully planned city along the Delaware River, and his frame of government guaranteed freedom of worship and an elected assembly. These policies attracted Quakers, Germans, Scots-Irish, and other European settlers, making Pennsylvania one of the most diverse and rapidly growing colonies. To give his new colony access to the sea, the Duke of York granted Penn the 3 lower counties on the Delaware, Newcastle, Kent, and Sussex, in 1682. These counties were governed jointly with Pennsylvania, but later gained their own assembly in 1704, gradually developing into what would become the separate colony of Delaware. Further south, the Chesapeake region saw the creation of another English colony. In 1632, King Charles I granted land along the Chesapeake Bay to Lord Baltimore, Cecil Calvert, creating Maryland. The colony was intended as a refuge for English Catholics facing persecution in Anglican England, though settlers of all faiths were allowed to live there. Maryland's geography, fertile soil and navigable rivers, made it ideal for agriculture. Tobacco quickly became the colony's cash crop, mirroring Virginia's plantation economy. Large estates along rivers allowed settlers to cultivate tobacco efficiently, creating a high demand for labor, first through indentured servants and later with enslaved Africans. Maryland's early boundaries were shaped by the Potomac River to the south and agreements with Virginia to the north. Religious tensions, particularly between Catholics and Protestants, influenced governance, and occasionally sparked unrest, but the colony grew steadily, forming a prosperous plantation society along the Chesapeake. As English colonization pressed southward, attention turned to the wide, fertile lands between Virginia and Spanish Florida, a region claimed by England but still largely unsettled by Europeans. In 1663, King Charles II rewarded 8 loyal supporters, known as the Lords Proprietors, by granting them this vast territory, creating the province of Carolina. The proprietors hoped to build a prosperous, well-organized colony, and they issued a constitution written with the help of philosopher John Locke, outlining a system of noble titles and large land grants meant to attract settlers. Carolina proved difficult to govern. Its population was scattered, and settlers often resisted the proprietors' plans. Many migrants came south from Virginia, clearing small farms in the northern part of the colony, where the soil supported tobacco, but the dangerous coastline made major ports impractical. This led to a looser, more independent society with smaller farms and fewer large plantations. Further south, near the deep natural harbor of Charleston, settlers from England and Barbados established a thriving trade center. They brought with them plantation knowledge and enslaved labor systems from the Caribbean, quickly transforming the area into a major producer of rice and later indigo. Charleston grew into one of the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan cities in the English colonies, a hub of trade linking the Americas, Africa, and Europe. Relations with native peoples were both cooperative and violent. Trade alliances brought profits, but conflicts were frequent and sometimes devastating. The most serious was the Yamasee War in 1715, when a powerful coalition of tribes nearly destroyed the southern settlements before being defeated, opening more land to English control. By 1712, the growing differences between the northern and southern settlements in economy, population, and governance led to the official division of Carolina into North Carolina and South Carolina, each with its own governor. When the proprietors failed to protect settlers during wars with Spain and native nations, the Crown purchased most of their interests in 1729, turning both colonies into royal colonies directly under the king's authority. The final link in England's chain of Atlantic colonies was forged in 1732, when James Oglethorpe, a soldier and philanthropist, secured a royal charter for the colony of Georgia. The project had 2 goals: to offer a fresh start for England's poor, especially debtors and those imprisoned for minor crimes, and to create a military buffer protecting South Carolina's plantations from Spanish Florida to the south and French influence to the west. Oglethorpe and the colony's trustees envisioned Georgia as a place of hard work and moral discipline. To prevent the rise of a wealthy planter elite, they banned slavery, limited the size of land grants, and restricted rum imports. Early settler, a mix of English poor, religious refugees like Salzburgers, and skilled tradesmen, laid out towns in an orderly grid pattern, the most famous being Savannah, designed with spacious squares that remain a hallmark of the city today. But these strict rules soon caused frustration. The land limits stifled economic growth, and without enslaved labor, Georgia struggled to compete with the booming rice plantations of South Carolina. Pressure from settlers and the practical needs of defending the frontier led to the gradual lifting of restrictions. By the 1750s, slavery was legalized, large estates were allowed, and Georgia transitioned toward the same plantation-based economy as its neighbors, relying on rice, indigo, and enslaved labor. Georgia's boundaries were initially shaped by the Savannah River to the north and agreements with Local Creek and other native nations to the west. As English settlement advanced inland, tensions flared but also produced treaties that ceded more land to the colony. In 1752, dissatisfied with the trustees' rule, the settlers petitioned the Crown, and Georgia became a royal colony, completing the line of 13 English colonies along the Atlantic coast. For decades, the colonies enjoyed a period of relative freedom known as Salutary Neglect. They largely governed themselves through local assemblies, while Britain focused on European wars and global trade. This autonomy allowed the colonists to grow used to making their own decisions and fostered a strong sense of independence, even as they still considered themselves loyal subjects of the Crown. But as the colonies grew wealthier and more self-reliant, Britain began tightening its grip on their trade. The Navigation Acts forced goods like sugar, tobacco, and timber to flow through English ports, enriching Britain's merchants, but frustrating colonists who wanted free trade. Meanwhile, the colonies were repeatedly pulled into Europe's great power struggles. From King William's War in 1689 to 1697 to Queen Anne's War in 1702 to 1713, colonists fought France and Spain for control of forts, frontiers, and trade routes. The fighting was brutal. Native nations were drawn into the wars, towns were raided, and borders shifted again and again. By the mid-17th century, one last great clash would decide who controlled North America: the French and Indian War. The conflict began in 1754 over control of the Ohio River Valley, a fertile region where British settlers and French traders both claimed the same land. The French had built a chain of forts stretching from Canada down to Louisiana, hoping to seal off British expansion westward. The British, backed by land-hungry colonists, saw this as a direct threat. A young Virginia militia officer named George Washington was sent to assert Britain's claim. But when his small force clashed with French troops near modern-day Pittsburgh, the encounter ended in disaster. Washington was surrounded at Fort Necessity and forced to surrender, a humbling start to his career. What began as a frontier skirmish soon exploded into a global struggle known as the 7 Years' War, pitting Britain and its colonies against France, Spain, and their native allies. The war raged across continents, from Europe and the Caribbean to West Africa and India. But in North America, it became a brutal contest of empires and alliances. Many native nations took sides. The Huron and Algonquin supported the French, while parts of the Iroquois Confederacy aligned with the British. Both European powers promised protection, trade, and territory. But to the tribes caught between them, it was a fight for survival. In the early years, France seemed to have the upper hand. French troops, aided by skilled native warriors, ambushed British columns in the dense forests of the frontier. Forts like Oswego and Fort William Henry fell, and colonial morale sank. But after William Pitt became Britain's prime minister in 1757, the tide turned. He poured money and troops into the war, turning it into a full-scale imperial campaign. Britain's powerful navy cut off French supply lines, and colonial militias joined British regulars in coordinated offensives. By 1759, the British launched a daring attack on the heart of New France, Quebec. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham proved decisive. Both commanders, General James Wolfe for Britain and General Montcalm for France, were killed, but Quebec fell, and with it, French power in Canada began to crumble. The final blow came when Spain, France's ally, entered the war in 1762. Britain responded with overwhelming force, capturing Havana in Cuba and Manila in the Philippines, Spain's richest colonial ports. To regain them, Spain was forced in the Treaty of Paris, 1763, to cede Florida to Britain. France, meanwhile, surrendered Canada and all its lands east of the Mississippi River, though it quietly handed Louisiana to Spain to prevent Britain from taking it. After nearly a decade of war, Britain emerged victorious and dominant across North America. To avoid new conflicts with native nations and to control the pace of westward expansion, Britain issued the Proclamation of 1763. It drew an imaginary line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains and banned colonists from settling west of it. The British hoped this would stabilize relations with native tribes and keep the frontier peaceful. But to many colonists, it felt like a betrayal. They had just fought and died to open these lands, and now they were told they could not use them. This resentment would be one of the first sparks of open discontent with British rule. At the same time, the cost of war had nearly bankrupted Britain. To raise money for defending its vast new territories, Britain began imposing new taxes to raise revenue. The Sugar Act of 1764 cracked down on smuggling and placed duties on goods like sugar, molasses, coffee, and wine, hurting merchants and ship owners. A year later, the Stamp Act of 1765 required that newspapers, legal papers, and even playing cards carry a paid royal stamp. Unlike earlier trade duties, this was a direct tax on everyday life, touching nearly every colonist. Outrage spread quickly, fueling the rallying cry of "no taxation without representation." Since colonists had no representatives in Parliament, they argued Britain had no right to tax them. Although Britain repealed the Stamp Act, it insisted it had the right to tax the colonies, and tensions escalated with the Townshend Acts of 1767, placing duties on glass, paint, and tea. Colonists formed committees of correspondence to coordinate their resistance. In March 1770, tensions boiled over in Boston, where British soldiers fired into a hostile crowd, killing 5 men, an event remembered as the Boston Massacre. The protests continued, culminating in 1773, when colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped crates of British tea into the sea, the Boston Tea Party. Britain struck back with the Coercive Acts, which closed Boston Harbor and put Massachusetts under tighter royal control. Far from intimidating the colonies, these acts united them. In 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress to organize a united response. Georgia, still reliant on British military protection against native tribes in Spain, did not attend. The Congress called for boycotts, urged colonies to train militias, and prepared for the possibility of war. The spark came in April of 1775. British troops marched to seize weapons stored at Concord, Massachusetts, but colonial militiamen confronted them at Lexington, where the shot heard round the world was fired. The skirmishes at Lexington and Concord ignited the American Revolution. When the Second Continental Congress met a month later, this time with all 13 colonies, including Georgia, represented, it appointed George Washington commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Fierce battles followed, including Bunker Hill, where the colonists inflicted heavy losses on the British, despite being forced to retreat. By 1776, the push for full independence could no longer be ignored. Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense electrified public opinion, arguing that monarchy was incompatible with liberty. On July 4, 1776, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson, proclaiming the birth of the United States of America. The war that followed was long and grueling. Washington's army suffered defeats around New York and nearly collapsed, but bold attacks at Trenton and Princeton revived the cause. In 1777, American forces won a decisive victory at Saratoga, convincing France to join the war as an ally, soon followed by Spain and the Dutch Republic. While France provided ships, soldiers, and supplies, Spain struck Britain from another front. Under Bernardo de Galvez, Spanish forces captured Baton Rouge, Mobile, and Pensacola, driving the British out of West Florida and cutting off their access to the Gulf of Mexico. At Valley Forge during the winter of 1777 to 1778, Washington's ragged army endured starvation and disease, but under the training of Baron von Steuben, they emerged as a disciplined fighting force. It was during this time that a new symbol of unity took shape: the American flag. In 1777, the Continental Congress approved a design featuring 13 stars and 13 stripes, representing the original colonies. Fighting shifted south in the later years of the war, with guerrilla leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, harassing British forces. The war's climax came in 1781, when Washington and French General Rochambeau trapped British General Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia, forcing his surrender. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris, 1783, officially ended the war. Britain recognized American independence and ceded territory east of the Mississippi River, doubling the size of the young nation. Spain, for its part, officially regained East and West Florida, restoring much of its old influence in the Gulf. The 13 colonies had become a republic, free to shape their own destiny and ready to expand into the continent beyond.